She sat in that room every single night, sorting other people's secrets, filing away other people's histories. Nobody learned her name, nobody asked her opinion, nobody looked twice. They called her the ugly secretary, and that was the greatest mistake anyone in that room ever made. Because while they were busy performing power, she was busy mapping it. Every name, every deal, every lie dressed up as policy, she had inherited something from her father that no amount of money could buy the ability to read what people try hardest to hide. And one night, a man walked into her archive. A man who knew everything about everyone in Chicago. A man so careful, so precise, that he had spent 11 years without a single blind spot. Until her. He needed her to decode a map. She needed him to find her father's killer. Simple enough, except the map led somewhere neither of them was prepared to go, and before it was over, one of them would have to choose between the mission and the truth, between protecting what they built and protecting the person standing beside them. Nobody in that dinner room saw it coming. Nobody was ready for what she revealed. This channel is not about crime. It is about the way certain people think. The way power actually works beneath the surface of what everyone else sees. Some people are born to lead. Some people are born to dominate. And there are lessons that no classroom, no degree, no corporate ladder will ever teach you, lessons that only the people who have operated at the highest and most dangerous levels of real power ever learn. This channel tells those stories. Welcome.
Nora Voss had memorized the location of 34,000 documents, and not one of them could tell her why her father had to die. It was 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night in late November, and the basement level of the Hargrove Institute was exactly the way she liked it. Empty, quiet, the kind of silence that had texture to it, the kind built from decades of paper and dust and climate-controlled air kept at precisely 65 degrees to preserve things that mattered. Outside the single high window, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in November. Snowing. The thin, quiet kind of snow that nobody notices until it has already covered everything. Nora was alone at the sorting table with a new donation box, salvage from a demolished building on the north side, gifted by a real estate company that wanted the tax write-off and the community goodwill. She worked through it efficiently, the way she always worked. Letters from the 1940s, family photographs with no names written on the back, yellowed architectural drawings folded into quarters. Every item handled with the same clean, practiced motion of someone who has spent her entire adult life with documents and does not waste a single gesture. She was on the last item when she stopped. A map. Not the recognition you get from familiarity, something more immediate than that. The drafting technique, the placement of notation symbols along the margins, the particular light pressure of the pen at the lower left corner, where her father always started, where he always anchored his work before moving outward. She had seen this hand before, in her father's study, the night before he died, when he was burning papers in the fireplace and told her it was just cleaning out things that did not matter anymore. This map should have burned with everything else. Nora did not panic. She did not look around the basement to confirm she was alone. She folded the map carefully along its existing creases, avoiding new ones, and slipped it into the inner pocket of her coat hanging from the hook beside the desk. Then she went back to the donation box and finished labeling it and put it on the sorting cart as if nothing in the world had changed. That fraction of a second between discovery and response. The way her hands did not shake, the way she just kept working. That was the thing. That was the habit that was going to matter in the weeks ahead, though she did not know it yet. Dennis appeared at the end of the shelving row. He was an accountant for the archive, cheerful in the uncomplicated way of people who sleep well and do not carry things they cannot put down. Dennis said, "We're ordering pizza if you want in. Everyone's working late." Nora said, "No thanks." Dennis said, "You look like you haven't eaten." Nora said, "I ate. I just look like this. He laughed and went back the way he came. Nora watched him go for half a second, not wishing she had said yes to the pizza, wishing for what Dennis represented, a life that did not include a map somebody had died over. Her father, Edmund Voss, had died 8 months ago. The official record called it an armed robbery. The case was closed in 72 hours. The detective assigned to the case took early retirement 3 months later with a pension that his salary alone could not explain. Nora had spent 8 months being careful. The kind of careful that is exhausting. The kind that means not asking questions loud enough for the wrong people to hear. It was the only thing keeping her brother Jake in school and keeping herself out of the ground. Jake was 22 and finishing his final year at a university in Boston. He believed what the police report said. Nora was covering the last of his tuition payments herself, cutting it from her rent and from dinners she skipped. She wanted Jake to graduate. She wanted Jake to have a life that had nothing to do with anything in tonight's donation box. She sat back down at the sorting table and opened the next item on her list. The map stayed in her coat pocket. It was there, a constant small weight against her ribs, for the rest of the night. At 5 minutes to 9, she went upstairs to do the closing check on the public reading room. The man was still there. He had been there for 4 hours. She knew because she had been tracking his visits. This was the third time in 2 weeks he had come to the Hargrove Institute's public archive and requested nothing. He simply arrived, sat at a table, and read from his own notebook. He was perhaps 42 years old, dressed like a university professor, plain wool sweater, reading glasses, no phone, no laptop. He looked unremarkable. But the environment around him was not unremarkable. Phil, the building's security guard, had opened the door to the reading room before this man reached the handle. Phil had worked at the Hargrove Institute for 15 years and had never stood up for a visitor. 2 other researchers currently in the room had shifted their seats to tables farther away without being asked and without seeming to notice they had done it. In 2024, a person who carried no phone and no laptop into an academic research room was not eccentric. That was a deliberate choice by someone who did not want a digital trail. Nora walked past his table on her way to retrieve a box from the back shelving. He did not look up from his notebook. But as she passed, without changing his tone, without pausing in his writing, the man said, "Box 7C has been reshelved out of sequence. Third shelf from the left. The 1940 to 1943 section is behind the 1951 to 1955 section. In case it matters." Nora stopped. She looked toward the shelving unit. He was right. Completely right. To recognize that, he would have needed to already know how the unit was organized and then notice the discrepancy. That was not normal visitor behavior. Nora said, "How do you know that?" The man looked up for the first time. His eyes were not cold. They were calculating. The way someone looks when they are reading a map rather than looking at a person. He said, "I notice things that are out of place. It's a habit." Nora went and retrieved her box. She sat back down at her desk and did not open it immediately. She sat still for a moment. The man who knew everything about a room had just told her he noticed what did not fit. The map in her coat pocket felt heavier. At 9 o'clock exactly, she did the final walkthrough. The man was still at his table, notebook closed now, and he was looking toward the door before she entered the room. Not when she entered, before. Nora said, "We closed at 9. The man said, "It's 8:58. Nora said, "You've been here 4 hours and you haven't requested anything from the archive." He stood slowly. He put on his coat without hurrying. He said, "Sometimes you come to a place to remember what it used to hold." Nora processed that sentence for 2 seconds. Then she said, not as a question but as a statement, "You knew Edmund Voss." The man did not confirm. He did not deny. He looked at her with something that might have been the first moment of real attention he had paid her, not scanning the environment but actually looking, and then he moved toward the door. Before he reached it, he said, "Your father was a very careful man, Miss Voss. It's a quality worth inheriting." Phil had the door open before the man touched the handle. Nora stood alone in the reading room. Her hand was in her coat pocket. Her fingers rested on the folded edge of the map. She had 34,000 documents memorized. She had no file on this man. That was either an accident or a warning. Nora had stopped believing in accidents 8 months ago. Her kitchen table, 6 in the morning. The map spread flat under the lamp she had dragged from the living room because the overhead light in the kitchen was not good enough. She had slept 3 hours. Her father had built a coding system into his cartographic work. He taught it to her when she was young, called it bedtime stories with hidden coordinates. What looked like standard notation carried a second layer of meaning underneath. She read it the way a native speaker reads text, not translating, just understanding. And what she was understanding, at her kitchen table in the dark before sunrise, was making her hands unsteady. 3 names embedded in the map. 2 she recognized from her father's professional life. The third she wished she did not recognize at all. Senator Harlan Mast, currently running for governor of Illinois on a platform of accountability and reform. The phone rang at 6:42. Unknown number. She let it ring. It rang again. And again. A third time. She answered. A man's voice said, "I need to see the map, Miss Voss, not to take it from you, to explain it." Nora said, "How do you have this number?" The voice said, "The same way I know you found it last night, the same way I know you haven't slept." She looked at the window, curtains drawn tight. She sat still for 8 seconds. That is what 8 full seconds of actual calculation looks like when someone is genuinely running the numbers. He was tracking her. He knew she had the map. Dangerous. Also the first real lead she had found in 8 months. Nora said, "Where?" He named a diner in Pilsen. She knew the neighborhood. Small place, been there since 1987, red vinyl booth seats and a counter with swivel stools. She did not bring the map. He was already there when she arrived. Corner table, back to the wall, facing the door. Not paranoia. A habit so ingrained it had become posture. He was the same man from the reading room, the wool sweater, the reading glasses, and he had ordered 2 coffees. The right order, without asking her. She did not comment on that. She noted it. This man prepared. She noticed that she had not brought the map, and he had noticed that she had not brought the map, and something in him settled when he saw it. She had made the right call. You do not bring leverage to a meeting you do not control. The man said, "Your father worked for me, not officially, not on paper. He was a cartographer in every sense of the word. He mapped things that couldn't be documented openly, relationships, financial flows, power structures. For 20 years he kept a private record of how this city actually operates, underneath the version everyone sees." Nora said nothing. He said, "Someone found out what he was doing, and I don't know who." Nora said, "And the map," he said, "is either a trap someone set, or it's what your father wanted to survive him. I need to know which one." Nora said, "You think I can tell you." He said, "I think you already know. I think you've known since last night." Nora drank her coffee. She set the cup down carefully. She said, "He built a coding system into his maps. He taught it to me when I was 9. He called it bedtime stories with hidden coordinates. That was the first real thing she gave him. Not because she trusted him, because this was the only path she could see toward understanding what her father had actually built. His name was Callum Reyes. He told her that without being asked, which told her something about how he wanted this to go. He laid out the offer plainly. He needed someone who could read the full map. She was the only person who could do that. He needed her working close to him, with the cover of secretary, assistant, the woman nobody pays attention to in his meetings. Nora said, "The safest place you can be right now is somewhere I can watch over," Callum said, "or the most dangerous." Nora said, "Yes, that too." A figure appeared on the sidewalk across the street through the diner window, standing still, doing nothing specific. She had seen the same figure that morning, 2 blocks from the institute. Same gray jacket, Same angle of the shoulders. Nora said, "The man in the gray jacket across the street, is he yours?" Callum said, "No." Nora said, "Then we have about 4 minutes." They left through the kitchen exit. In a small room above the diner that Callum seemed to already know about, they faced each other without the ambient noise of the restaurant between them. Nora said, "I want to find who killed my father." Callum said, "I know." Nora said, "And you want the map decoded?" Callum said, "I want to understand what he was trying to tell us when he made sure it survived him." Nora said, "Then we want the same thing." She set one condition. She said, "I'll work in your world, whatever cover you need. But I want to be clear about one thing. I am not your secretary, Mr. Reyes. I am choosing to play that role because it is strategically useful. The title is yours to use. What I actually am, that's mine to define." Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Agreed." She did not trust him. She trusted the fact that he had known her father, and her father had been the most careful man she had ever met. Whatever Callum Reyes was, Edmund Voss had considered him worth mapping. In 8 months of nothing, that was almost everything. The 14th floor of an unremarkable office building in the West Loop. No name on the door, no company logo. From the outside, it could have been any small professional suite, a consulting firm, a law practice, something quiet and forgettable. Inside, it was the workspace of someone who actually worked, not a display of power, not the decorator's vision of what authority looks like. Maps of Chicago covered one entire wall, 4 of them in sequence: 1871 after the fire, 1920 during Prohibition, 1968 in the year the city tore itself apart, 2010 in the current configuration. The filing system was immediately recognizable to Nora as a real archival system, functional rather than decorative. The desk light was positioned at exactly the angle that someone who reads for hours would choose, not the angle that makes a person look important in photographs. And interspersed among the Chicago maps were others, drawings she recognized by the hand. Nora walked toward the wall slowly. She pressed 2 fingertips against the lower left corner of the nearest one, the place where the anchor point always was, the place where her father always started. She said, "That's my father's work." Callum said, "12 years of it. He updated them every quarter." Nora said, "He never showed me these." Callum said, "He was protecting you." Nora said, "From what?" Callum said, "From knowing what he knew. He made a choice early on. He decided that you and your brother were worth more to him safe and ignorant than informed and at risk." Nora stood looking at the wall. 20 years of work her father had done in silence, work he had never described to her. 12 years of coming to this room, to this specific building, to work with this specific man, and she had never known. She had thought she knew her father. She had thought the gaps in what he told her were ordinary gaps, the kind every parent has, the things you don't share with your children because they are adult problems, and your children are not adults yet. She had not understood that the gaps were deliberate architecture. That was love and loneliness woven so tightly together that you could not separate them. Callum said, "Take whatever time you need." Nora turned around. She said, "Let's start." She spread her copy of the map on the clear half of his desk. He stood on the opposite side, and for the next 3 hours they did what they were both, in their separate ways, built to do. Nora decoded. Callum provided context. She would identify a symbol, translate it into a name or a location, and he would tell her what that name meant in the actual world, the relationships attached to it, the significance of the dates encoded nearby. He understood quickly, faster than she expected, not because he already knew the system, but because he had enough contextual knowledge to follow her reasoning as soon as she established the logic. She named a location early in the second hour and asked if he recognized it. He did not answer with words. He walked to his filing cabinet, opened the 3rd drawer from the left, counted 6 folders in from the front, and extracted exactly the right one. No hesitation, no checking the label. The same body memory precision she used in her own archive. Nora said, "You organize by the same system my father used." Callum said, He taught me. A small silence. She looked back at the map. Something had shifted, not full trust, not anywhere close to that, but recognition. This man had known her father, not known about him, known him. They worked through the afternoon and into the early evening. The city went dark outside the windows without either of them noticing. The map yielded its layers one at a time, the way a palimpsest does, one meaning underneath another, and what came clear as the layers came up was not what either of them had been expecting. Edmund Voss had not simply charted relationships. He had documented evidence. Every significant transaction he had been able to verify, every meeting he had been able to place, every transfer of money through every channel he had identified, 20 years of it, meticulous, encoded, preserved in the visual language of a cartographer who understood that what he was carrying would be dangerous to any ordinary paper trail. And the map was not the evidence itself. The map was the guide to where the evidence was hidden. 7 separate locations. 7 pieces of a case that, assembled together, would be comprehensive enough to bring down not one person, but a structure, a system of relationships that had been operating underneath the visible surface of Chicago's politics and criminal enterprise for 2 decades. Nora looked up from the last section she had decoded and said, "He built a library." Callum said, "He built a bomb." Nora said, "And he left the detonator to me." Callum did not answer that immediately. He was looking at the map with an expression she was starting to learn. The flat, contained look of someone managing the gap between what they expected and what they are being given. She was still reading the last decoded section when she noticed a name she had not seen in the map before. Not one of the 7 evidence locations. Not masked. Not any of the political or financial figures who had been appearing throughout the document. A different kind of entry. Personal. She said, "Who is Daniel?" Callum went quiet for longer than he had gone quiet at any point in the afternoon. Then he said, "My younger brother." Nora waited. He said it flat, the voice of someone who has told this story to himself enough times that it has lost the shape of a story and become just a sequence of facts. Daniel had worked in finance, honest and careful and very good at what he did. He had been building a case against some of the same people Callum had been watching for years, building it quietly and alone, without telling his brother because he was afraid Callum would stop him. Daniel had disappeared on a Thursday morning 11 years ago. His car turned up near the river. No body was ever found. The case was still technically open. Everyone involved understood it was not going to be resolved. Callum said, "That's why I became very good at knowing things before they become problems." Nora looked at Daniel's name in the map. Her father had put it there. Her father had tracked what had happened to Daniel Reyes. He had found out somehow, and he had encoded it alongside everything else. He had not let it be forgotten. She said, "My father mapped what happened to your brother. It's all here." She watched Callum's hands, resting flat on the edge of the desk. She saw them go very still. He said, "Show me." Nora did not point at the map and explain. She stood up, walked around to his side of the desk, positioned the document between them, and she read it to him, item by item, slowly. Not because he couldn't have read it himself, because this was news about his brother. And she had been the person who got news about a loved one alone, sitting in a car outside a police station with a closed case file in her hands. And she would not do that to someone else if she could help it. When she finished, Callum did not say anything for 30 seconds. They stood close together, both looking at the map, and neither of them spoke. Then quietly, he said, "He left a map for every person he lost. Your father was very thorough." Nora said, "He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he had." She gathered her things. She put on her coat. At the door, without turning around, she said, "He was right about the filing system. Yours is better organized than mine." She left before he could respond. In 11 years of working alone, it was the first compliment Callum Reyes had not seen coming. Monday morning, Nora arrived at Callum's office at 8:50. She had not bought new clothes, had not changed her hair. She was exactly herself, in a new location. Callum introduced her to the people who came through the office in the first hour. His new assistant. She handled research and scheduling. People looked at her, processed the information, and moved on. Marcus Webb, Callum's senior associate, a man in his late 40s with the careful grooming and the watchful eyes of someone who had been in proximity to dangerous things for a long time, glanced at her once and returned to his phone. His expression communicated everything without saying anything. Irrelevant. That was exactly what she needed. People imagine that a secretary is the person who sits and executes instructions. What a secretary actually is the only person who gets into every room without anyone asking questions. Nobody guards themselves around the person who carries the coffee. That is the most advantageous position in the world for someone who pays attention. Her father had taught her that. He just had not specified when she would need to use it. She spent the morning watching the office function. She noted names, voices, the body language of everyone who addressed Callum, who retreated first from a conversation, who stayed last, who spoke freely, and who was performing for an audience. She did not take notes. She did not need to. In the afternoon, Callum was in a meeting with 3 associates. Nora sat outside the conference room with a document box and her laptop. Anyone walking past the glass partition saw a secretary doing administrative work. She was cross-referencing guest lists from 3 of Senator Mast's fundraising events over the past 4 years, with the financial data encoded in her father's map. Building a timeline. Not a political timeline, not the kind you find in newspaper archives. A timeline of specific meetings, specific money, specific decisions made in specific rooms on specific dates. She worked for 2 hours. She was systematic about it, the way archivists are systematic, starting with the clearest connections and working outward. By 3 o'clock, she had confirmed what Mast's presence in the map meant. By 4 o'clock, she had found something else, a second name, someone who appeared in her father's encoded documentation 17 times across 15 years. 17 entries, each carefully dated, each connected to specific transactions and meetings. A name that appeared in no public filing, no official record, no newspaper article. Marcus Webb, Callum's most trusted associate. 9 years at Callum's side. Nora closed the laptop. She looked at her hands on the desk in front of her. She had found the betrayal inside the building she was sitting in, and she could not tell Callum, not yet, because she did not know whether Callum already knew, because she did not have enough to be certain of the full shape of what Webb had done, and because in this world, being wrong about an accusation was worse than staying quiet for one more day. She needed to watch. She needed to understand the full picture before she said a word. At the end of the day, the office cleared out. Callum was still at his desk when Nora carried a document box back from the storage room and set a sandwich on the corner of his desk without comment. Callum looked at the sandwich. He looked at her. He said, "You don't have to do that." Nora said, "I know. Eat." He ate. He didn't offer formal thanks, but the way he ate, without rushing, paying attention to it the way you pay attention to something. When you are not sure how many quiet afternoons you have left, she took that as acknowledgement enough. They sat and worked in the same room in silence for an hour. Same rhythm. No need to fill the pauses. She had not sat in a room with another person and worked in comfortable silence in a long time. And she noticed the rarity of it, the way you notice things you didn't know you'd been missing. Her phone rang. "Jake." She answered, and her voice shifted automatically, lighter and warmer, the particular register she had developed for conversations with her brother that kept everything difficult out of the frame. Jake said he might come to Chicago at the end of the month. He wanted to go to the Italian restaurant on Lincoln Square that their father had always liked, the one where Edmund always ordered the same pasta and always pretended to consider the menu anyway. Nora said that sounded good. She smiled. She said she would make a reservation. She hung up, and the warmth in her face settled back into what it had been. Callum, without looking up from his work, said, He doesn't know. Not a question. Nora said, he's in his final year. He has a thesis to finish. He has a girlfriend and a life that has nothing to do with any of this. Callum said, your father did the same thing. He protected the people he loved by keeping them away from what he knew. He carried it alone. Nora said, is that a warning or a comparison? Callum said, an observation. The Voss family has a pattern. She looked at him. She knew he was right. Knowing he was right did not change her decision, but she noted it, filed it, the way she filed everything. The day ended. She was putting on her coat when Callum said, same time tomorrow? Nora said, I have work at the Institute until noon. After that. Callum said, I'll have food here. Nora said, you don't need to do that. Callum said, you brought sandwiches this morning. Nora said, that was different. Callum said, was it? She did not answer. She left. In the elevator going down, she thought about the way he had eaten the sandwich. Deliberate, unhurried, like a man who understood that quiet afternoons were not guaranteed and intended to be present for this one. She recognized that feeling from the inside. She had been living it for 8 months. 4 days into her new role, Nora arrived at the Hargrove Institute for her morning shift and knew before she reached the basement that something was wrong. She had been inside the archive long enough to know its specific equilibrium. The temperature, the smell, the particular quality of the silence. Something was different. Barely, but different. She found it in the third aisle, a document box that had been opened and resealed in an order that was almost correct. The kind of almost that would not register for most people. For Nora, it was as obvious as a stranger's handwriting in her own notebook. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been visibly disturbed, but someone had been in her archive. She called Callum. He was there in 20 minutes. He moved through the space without touching anything he did not need to, which she noticed. He did not treat her archive as a crime scene to be processed. He treated it as her space, and he was a guest in it who had been asked for help. He told her 3 people had access the previous night. 2 were her colleagues with keycards. The third had come through the loading dock, where a 14-second gap existed in the camera coverage at the top of every hour. Whoever had done this had known about that gap. Nora said, you've mapped this building. Callum said, I map every building where someone I'm responsible for spends time. A pause. Nora said, am I someone you're responsible for? Callum said, you are now. They needed to identify who had sent the person who came through the loading dock. Callum knew someone. He called her Vera Kowalski, a woman who ran a dry cleaning operation on the north side, and in parallel maintained a comprehensive understanding of the low-level criminal activity in her part of the city. Not an overtly dangerous figure. The kind of dangerous that looks like a businesswoman who has been around long enough to know where everything is buried. Nora went with him. She wanted to see how he operated in his world. They met Vera in a corner booth of a diner in Andersonville. Vera was perhaps 52, small and precise, with the specific quality of attention that comes from years of knowing things she was not supposed to know. Nora watched Callum work. He did not threaten. He never raised his voice. He asked questions, but the questions were structured in a way that made clear he already knew the answers and was simply giving Vera the opportunity to be the one who confirmed them. His power in that conversation was not the power of someone who would hurt you if you withheld information. It was the power of someone who knew enough about you that having him as an ally was clearly preferable to having him as an adversary. Vera looked at Nora and said, without preamble, Edmund's daughter. Not a question. Vera said, everyone who mattered in this city knew Edmund. She turned to Callum. The person who sent whoever went into that archive, they don't want the documents. They want her. On the walk back to the car, Callum said the thing he had not said yet. He said, your father didn't leave that map in the archive by accident. He arranged for that specific donation box to go to your archive, to arrive during your shift. He set it up months before he died. Nora stopped on the sidewalk. November wind off the lake. She said, he knew someone was going to come for him. Callum said, He knew it was a real possibility, so he built a fail-safe, a way for the work to survive, even if he didn't. Nora said, "Me." Callum said, "You." He trusted you to find it, to read it, and to understand what to do with it. He spent 20 years keeping you away from everything he was involved in. The last decision he made was that you were the only person who could finish what he started. The November wind was doing what November wind in Chicago does, finding every gap between coat and collar, between glove and sleeve. Nora stood in it and let it happen. This was not only grief, there was something else in it, something harder to name. Her father had seen her. He had known her well enough to put the most important thing he had ever built into her hands. Not by instructing her, by choosing her. Nora said, "He could have destroyed all of it." Callum said, "Yes." Nora said, "He chose not to." Callum said, "He chose you." They stood there for a moment in the cold. Then Nora said, "Callum." They both noticed. It was the first time she had used his given name. A small thing, not small. She said, "When this is over, what happens to you?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "That's the first time you've used my name." She said, "Answer the question." He said, "I don't know yet." It was clearly true. She could hear it. She nodded once and started walking. He stood on the sidewalk until she turned the corner. 11 years. He had kept a file on every person who had passed through his life with enough weight to matter. But her, the way she decoded the map, the way she moved through a room appearing to look at nothing while she catalogued everything, the way she said his name like it was a decision she had made rather than a reflex, she still had no file. For the first time in 11 years, he was not sure he wanted to open one. He explained the event the afternoon before, a fundraising dinner at a Gold Coast restaurant, the kind of gathering Mast attended once a month. 12 people in a private room, a catered meal, money changing hands for causes everyone understood were not the actual reason the room existed. Callum needed to be there to see who had been unsettled since the archive breach. He needed a reason to attend that would not raise flags. Nora was that reason. He said, "Nobody's going to pay attention to a man who brings his assistant to a charity dinner." Nora said, "You want me to be invisible again." He said, "I want you to be exactly what everyone in that room has already decided you are. The woman nobody looks at twice." She considered him for a moment. She said, "You've spent 11 years doing the same thing. The professor glasses, the plain sweater, no phone, no laptop in public. You've built your entire operation around people underestimating what they're looking at." Callum said nothing. She said, "We're more alike than you'd probably like to admit." He still said nothing, but the silence was a different kind of silence than his usual silence. Nora went home and changed into the plainest black dress she owned, the kind of dress that people look at and then look past. She did not buy anything new. She did not do anything with her hair that she would not do on a working day. In her small evening bag, she placed 2 things: a flash drive containing the digitized images of her father's complete map system, and a photograph of Edmund Voss, a candid shot, her father at the kitchen table with his morning coffee, looking out the window, as ordinary as anyone's father looks on an ordinary morning. She was not certain what she would do with either of those things, but if the right moment opened up, she intended to be ready for it. The restaurant was a building that had been in the same family since 1963. Private room on the 3rd floor. 12 people at a long table. She identified the guests as they arrived, the way she identified documents in a new collection, building the taxonomy before attempting to read anything. Senator Harlan Mast sat at the far end of the table with the settled authority of a man who had been the most important person in rooms like this for 20 years. Nora sat beside Callum. She refilled water glasses when they ran low. She answered questions about scheduling when someone asked. She nodded along with remarks about the weather and the upcoming legislative session. People looked through her the way they look through furniture that has been in a room so long it stops registering as furniture. That was fine. She was not there to be seen. She was there to listen. Someone near the middle of the table was cutting off a colleague mid-sentence and had been doing it all evening. Nora noted it. Someone 3 seats to the left was referring to Mast with a deference that came from fear rather than respect. The slight over-precision of someone who was very aware of owing something. She noted it. And Marcus Webb, seated 3 chairs from Callum on the opposite side of the table, had failed to meet Callum's eyes during their only direct exchange of the evening. A man who had worked alongside Callum for 9 years. A man who should have had no reason to avoid his employer's gaze. She noted it. Halfway through the main course, someone mentioned Edmund Voss in passing. A casual reference to Chicago architectural history, the kind of name that appears in historical conversations about the city. Completely incidental. Mast's hand stopped halfway through lifting his wine glass. Half a second. Then the smile returned, identical to before. Nora saw it. Callum, across the table, saw it. Both of them registered that the other one had seen. After the dessert plates were cleared, Mast stood for a toast. He spoke warmly about transparency and accountability in leadership. Everyone at the table applauded. Callum applauded. Webb applauded. Nora looked at her wine glass. Then Mast did the thing she had been half expecting. He looked down the table toward her with the full warm attention of a man who had been professionally charming rooms for 30 years, and he said, "Forgive me, I don't think I caught your name." It was a trap. He wanted to hear her say it so he could confirm what he already suspected. She felt Callum shift slightly beside her, the smallest possible movement, readable only to someone paying very close attention. The message was clear. Don't. Nora looked at Senator Harlan Mast, and then she did the thing that was not in anyone's plan. She smiled, for the first time all evening, and said in the same tone of voice you would use to comment on the weather, "Nora Voss. Edmund Voss was my father." The room changed, not loudly, nobody dropped anything, nobody said a word, but the temperature shifted. 3 or 4 people who recognized that name stopped moving. Mast's expression did not change, not a visible muscle, but his hand below the tablecloth closed around his napkin. Mast said carefully, "Edmund Voss. He was a remarkably talented historian." Nora said pleasantly, "Cartographer. There's a real difference. Historians record what happened. Cartographers record where everything is. My father was exceptional at knowing where everything was." Mast said, "Is that so? And what was he mapping, in your understanding?" Nora held his gaze without effort. She said, "Chicago. He spent 20 years mapping Chicago. Everything he felt was worth keeping track of." A pause. Short, but everyone in the room felt it, even the ones who did not understand what it meant. Mast produced the warm smile again. He said, "Remarkable dedication. I'm sure his legacy will be a real contribution to the city's historical record." Nora said, "I'm certain it will." She lifted her wineglass. "When the time is right." She set the glass down and turned to the person on her left and asked a pleasant question about the neighborhood preservation project she had heard mentioned earlier in the evening. The dinner continued. Across the table, Callum was looking at her. For the first time in 11 years, he was in the middle of a situation he had not anticipated. The person who had created it was the one person he had no file on. He noticed, with something that surprised him, that he was not unsettled. He was paying very close attention. In the car afterward, neither of them spoke for the first 3 minutes. Then Callum said, "That wasn't the plan." Nora said, "No." He said, "You told him who you are." She said, "He already knew. I stopped letting him pretend he didn't." Callum said, "Do you understand what you just did?" Nora said, "Yes. I put myself on the board openly instead of being a piece nobody knew to look for. Now he has to make a move. When he moves, we see him." A pause. Callum said, "That's actually a better play than what I had." Nora said, "I know." She waited until they were on Lake Shore Drive, the city lights running along the water, before she said, "Callum, I need to tell you something about Marcus Webb." And she told him everything. What she had found 4 days ago, what she had confirmed in the days since, why she had waited to be certain, why she had waited to trust him with it. She said, I needed to watch you work before I knew whether you already knew, whether you were covering for him. Callum said, and now? Nora said, and now I've watched you. At dinner tonight, when Mass looked at me, you moved, not to protect yourself, to cover me. You didn't even think about it. Callum was quiet for a long moment. He said, Webb has been with me for 9 years. Nora said, I know. I'm sorry. Callum said, Don't be sorry. Be right. He looked at her. He said, Are you right? Nora said, Yes. He said, Show me everything tomorrow. She walked into that dinner as a secretary. She walked out as something else entirely. Not a weapon, not a player in any formal sense, but a woman who had chosen, in a room full of people maintaining careful fictions about who they were, to simply say the true thing, to say her own name and her father's name, and let the room decide what to do with it. Callum sat beside her as the car moved north through the city, and for the first time in 11 years, he found himself following someone else's lead. The surprising thing, the thing he had not expected, was that he did not mind. The morning after the dinner, before Nora could reach Callum's office with her full documentation on Webb, Marcus Webb found her first. He was waiting outside the Hargrove Institute when she arrived for her morning shift. Standing by the entrance in the cold, no coat despite the temperature, which told her he had been there for a while and had stopped noticing the physical discomfort. He said he needed to talk to her. He said it was important. He said it was about Callum. They sat in the reading room. The room was empty at 8 in the morning. Phil was at his desk in the lobby and could be seen through the glass wall, which Nora noted was useful. Webb said that Callum had received a warning, a specific, credible warning. 1 week before Edmund Voss died. Someone in the network was in direct danger. Callum had assessed the intelligence, identified who he believed the target to be, and increased security around those individuals. He had not included Edmund on the list. Edmund Voss died 7 days later. Webb said, I'm telling you this because you deserve to know before you go any further into his world. Nora looked at Webb for a long moment. She understood immediately what he was doing. He was using a true thing to cover a worse thing about himself. The information about Callum might be accurate. Webb's reasons for giving it to her were not as clean as he was presenting them. She said, Where did you get this? Webb said, I was there. I was present when the report came in. Nora said, Then why didn't you warn my father yourself? He did not answer quickly enough. She said, You either pointed someone at my father as a problem that needed handling, or you saw the warning arrive and said nothing. One of those two things happened. Which one is it? Webb stood up and left the reading room. He walked out without answering. Nora sat alone in the early morning archive for a few minutes. Then she put on her coat and walked to the West Loop. She went straight to Callum's office. She did not call ahead. She did not stop at the desk outside. She walked directly in. Callum was at his desk with his morning coffee. He looked up when she entered. Nora said, Did you receive a warning about a direct threat to someone in your network? 1 week before my father died? Callum looked at her. There was a pause, a short one, but it existed. That pause was the answer. Nora said, Tell me. He told her plainly. No softening. He received the warning. The intelligence indicated that he was the target. He assessed the risk, identified the most likely points of vulnerability, and increased security around 3 people in his network. Edmund was not among them because the information did not point at Edmund. Edmund died 7 days later. Callum said, I've known this for 8 months. Nora said, You let me spend a week in this room, reading his maps, learning about your brother, telling you things I haven't told another person. The whole time, you knew you might have been able to save him. Callum said, I didn't know that my assessment was wrong until after. Nora said, You knew enough to wonder, and you didn't tell me. He did not deny it. He did not offer an explanation that would make it better, because he understood that there wasn't one, and because she would hear the emptiness in any attempt. He said the honest thing. He said, I was afraid that if you knew you would stop, and I needed you to finish decoding the map. That was not a beautiful confession. It was a true one. And in some ways that made it worse than any excuse, because an excuse can be argued with, but honesty just sits there. Nora looked at him for a long time. She said, At least that's honest. She started putting on her coat. Then Callum's phone rang, and one of his people spoke, and the expression on his face changed. Mast was making a move toward Jake. In Boston, tonight. Callum made 3 phone calls. He was fast and precise, and inside 4 minutes the situation was handled. Jake's building had people from Callum's network outside it. Jake did not know. Jake was safe. Nora watched him work. He protected Jake, the brother of the man he had failed to protect, without being asked, without hesitation, because it was the thing he could do right now. She pulled on her coat. She said, Jake is safe. That's what matters right now. Callum said, Nora, she said, I'll send you everything on web tonight. You'll have all of it. He said, That's not what I'm trying to say. She said, Good night, Callum. The door closed. He stood in the empty office. He looked at the map on the table. He looked at the 2 cups from that morning, hers still half full. 11 years. He had known everything about everyone. He had known, with uncomfortable precision, what it was going to cost her to learn what he had been holding back. He had told himself the mission came first. He had also known, with the same precision, that he was lying to himself when he said it. There are things you know and still choose not to act on. Those are always the ones that end up costing the most. 3 days. Nora did not go to the West Loop office. She did not answer Callum's calls, which came twice on the first day, and not at all after that. She went to the Hargrove Institute for her morning shifts. She came home in the early afternoon. She sat at the kitchen table with her father's materials spread around her, and she worked. She traced the 7 evidence locations from the map, building out the full picture of what Edmund had assembled. She read every encoded document with the specific attention of someone who was no longer surprised by what she might find, which meant she read it differently, more accurately. And what she understood, by the second day, was this. Her father had known about Callum fully. He had documented Callum the way he documented everything, the good and the difficult, and the moments of failure. The warning that had preceded Edmund's death was in the record. Edmund had known about the error in judgment. He had recorded it. He had not omitted it, or softened it, or found a way to explain it away. And he had still chosen Nora to go to Callum. He had still designed the entire failsafe so that she would end up in that office, working with that man, finishing the work. That was not Edmund forgiving Callum. That was Edmund believing in something he had seen over 15 years that ran deeper than the worst thing Callum had ever done. On the evening of the second day, Jake called. She let it go to voicemail. Then she called him back. She told him the truth. Not everything, but enough. Their father had done dangerous work for a long time because he believed it mattered. The work had eventually gotten him killed. She was in the process of finishing it, and she needed Jake to stay where he was and let her handle it. Jake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Did he trust you to finish it? Nora said, Yes. Jake said, Then finish it, Nora. That's what he was telling you. The whole thing was him saying that. While Nora worked alone, Callum was not idle. He met with Marcus Webb. He brought the documentation Nora had sent him the night she left. He set it on the table between them. He gave Webb 2 choices: leave Chicago and sever all connection to anything related to Edmund Voss, or face everything that was in the documentation. Webb chose to leave. He was gone within 48 hours. Callum came back to the office and sat at his desk. He opened his laptop. He created a new file. He typed a name at the top of it: Nora Voss. He looked at the blank page below the name for a long time. Then he closed the file without filling it in. He did not delete it. He left it there, blank, and opened something else. It was the first time in 11 years that he had chosen not to know in advance. Nobody saw him do it. That was important. Real change does not need a witness. It happens in a quiet room, when no one is watching, when you stop being able to maintain the version of yourself you have been carrying. Senator Mast moved against the Hargrove Institute 3 days after the dinner. He used political connections to request that the Institute surrender documents potentially relevant to a federal inquiry. Legal language wrapping a very simple goal: make things disappear into a process that never resolves. Callum released preliminary evidence of Mast's connection to the archive breach to 3 independent journalists simultaneously. Not enough to prosecute. Enough for Mast to understand that if he pushed further, the story became something he could not contain. Mast withdrew the request. But Callum had only delayed him, not stopped him. The only way to stop him was to finish what Edmund had started, to collect the 7 pieces of evidence and place them somewhere that Mast could not reach. And the only person who could navigate the full map to find those 7 pieces was not answering his calls. He knew her address. He could find her in 20 minutes. But finding her and having any right to ask her to come back were 2 completely different things. He was only just beginning to understand the difference. 7 days after she left, Nora walked into Callum's office in the morning. No call ahead. She arrived. Phil held the door open. He gave her a nod, not the nod of someone managing proximity to a situation, just the nod of one person acknowledging another. Callum was at his desk. He looked up. He set his book down more slowly than usual. Nora said, "I have 2 conditions." Callum said, "Tell me." She said, "First, if you receive information that affects my safety or Jake's, you tell me immediately, not after you've calculated whether it serves the larger strategy." He said, "Agreed." She said, "Second, when this is over, when Mast has been handled and my father's work is placed where it needs to be, I want to know everything, not a summary. Everything. I'll decide what I do with it." He said, "That's not a small ask." She said, "No, it's what I need." He said, "Agreed." She said, "I'm not telling you I've forgiven you." He said, "I'm not asking you to." She said, "I'm telling you that I understand why you made the choice you made, and I think you were wrong, and I think you know you were wrong." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's enough to keep going." She put her coat over the back of her chair. Her chair, the one she had been sitting in since the first day. She said, "Show me where we are." They collected the 7 pieces of evidence over the following 4 days. The first 6 were in Chicago, in locations her father had encoded carefully, each requiring a specific combination of the archival knowledge Nora carried and the contextual knowledge Callum carried to access. They worked as a team, and they were effective, more effective than either of them would have been alone. The 7th piece was in Boston. Her father had purchased a book and donated it to a public library branch near Jake's University 12 years earlier. The evidence was in the back cover, a small sealed envelope containing a flash drive. Jake found it. He was not technically supposed to be involved. He involved himself anyway, because he was Edmund Voss's son, and Edmund Voss's children had a pattern of deciding when they were ready. When all 7 pieces were assembled and read together, the full picture was there. 20 years of documentation. Every significant intersection between political power and organized crime in Chicago during that period. Constructed not to destroy people wholesale, but to ensure that when the time was right, the evidence would be in the right hands. Callum looked at the assembled record for a long time. Then he looked at Nora. He said, "He planned the entire thing." Nora said, "From the beginning." Callum said, "Even us." Nora said, "Especially that." What Edmund Voss had intended was not a prosecution and not a press release. An archive. The Hargrove Institute. The evidence housed as historical documentation under academic credentialing, encoded so that only someone who understood both the cartographic language and the archival system could read it in full. Preserved according to the strict protocols of an institution that had been protecting documents since 1923. The place where his daughter worked. The person who understood both the map and the archive. It had always been going there. Callum met with Senator Harlan Mast one final time, alone, in a conference room in a building on Michigan Avenue. He placed a summary document on the table, precise enough for Mast to understand exactly what existed and exactly where it was going. He said, "This goes into a sealed historical archive. It sits there for 25 years. By then, either the world has changed enough that it doesn't matter, or it matters enough that it should be found." Mast said, "And if I take action against any of the people involved in this?" Callum said, "If you move against Nora Voss, her brother, anyone at the Hargrove Institute, anyone connected to this, everything goes out tomorrow. All of it. All at once." Mast said, "You'd expose yourself in the process." Callum said, "Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something designed to protect people. I'm in the business of honoring that work. What I expose in the process matters considerably less than what I protect." Mast sat with that for a long moment. Then he stood up and left the room without another word. That was the most important sentence Callum had spoken in the entire course of everything that had happened. Nora was not in the room. She never heard him say it. That was the point. That was the proof. Integrity is not who you are when the person you love is watching. It is who you are when nobody is watching at all. Callum came to the archive that evening. He brought coffee. He did not call ahead. Nora was at the processing table, finishing the final documentation on the incoming archive materials. She looked up when he came through the door. She said, "It's done?" He said, "Mast won't move. The materials are secure. Phil has the access protocols for the sealed collection." She nodded. He set the coffee down on the corner of the table. Then he said, "There's something else." He told her about the conversation with Mast, not the strategy of it, not the tactical thinking, just what he had said and why he had said it. She listened. She looked at him. She said, "You meant that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That's different from before." He said, "Yes." She stood up and walked to a specific section of the archive shelving. She retrieved a small box that had been cataloged in the Institute's system under her employee identification number, flagged with a note reading "Personal access only, hold for owner." She set it on the table between them. She said, "His journals, 20 years of them. Everything he thought about but didn't encode in the maps. Every conversation he had with himself when the work got too heavy to carry alone." She slid the box toward him. She said, "He filed them under my access, but with your name on the internal note. He knew you would end up here eventually." Callum looked at the box. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "He mapped everything, didn't he?" Nora said, "Everything he thought was worth keeping." The archive was quiet around them. The city ran its late traffic outside, muffled by the building's old walls. The ceiling lights cast a steady yellow warmth across the shelving rows, across the document boxes that lined every wall, across 34,000 records of what people had considered important enough to preserve. Callum said, "What do you want to do after all of this?" Nora said, "Keep doing what I do, cataloging things, reading patterns, finding what people leave behind." She looked at him. She said, "You?" He said, "I want to stop knowing everything about everyone before they know it themselves. I want to start with something I don't know yet and find out what it is." Nora said, "That sounds genuinely frightening for you." He said, "Yes, it does." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is a research consultation position opening at the Institute, someone who can read patterns in historical records and connect them to present context. Someone who understands how the same human behaviors show up in documents from 1920 and documents from last Tuesday." She paused. She said, "It pays very poorly." Callum said, "I don't need the money." She said, "I know." He said, "Is this a job offer?" She said, "It is an offer of a reason to show up somewhere every day where someone will notice if you don't." He crossed the space between them. Slowly. He put his hand against her face the way she pressed her fingertips to a document she wanted to be certain was real, checking its weight and texture. She did not move. He said, "I'll show up." 6 months later. There was a second desk in Nora's section of the archive. Leather notebook, 2 pens, no computer, 3 afternoons a week. A research project they were building together. A comprehensive historical record of how Chicago changed across the decades. Not designed to expose anyone. Designed to ensure that what mattered didn't get lost. Dennis stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon, looked at Callum sitting with a folder open in front of him, looked at Nora, looked back at Callum, and said, "Has he been staring at that folder for 20 minutes?" Nora said, "That's how he reads." Dennis said, "Right," and walked on with his coffee. Jake came to visit for a weekend in May. He had graduated 2 months earlier, with honors, and had taken a job in Boston that he was genuinely excited about. He had met Callum 3 times now. He had stopped being visibly unsettled by him around the second visit. On the Saturday afternoon, he and Nora were walking along the lakefront and Jake said, "He's still a little terrifying." Nora said, "He's a lot of things." Jake said, "Dad would have liked him." She did not answer. She did not disagree. Phil, the security guard, had been at the Hargrove Institute for 15 years and had seen many things come through its doors. He had watched Callum Reyes move through the world for the better part of a year now, first as a visitor, then as a regular presence in the reading room, now as someone who showed up 3 afternoons a week and sat at a desk in the archive section with a notebook and 2 pens. On a Thursday evening in late spring, he watched Callum and Nora leave the building together. Callum held the door. They walked out into the evening, talking about something, neither of them in any hurry. Phil nodded at Callum on the way out. Not the careful nod of someone managing their proximity to a dangerous person. Not the particular deference of someone who understood what Callum Reyes had been and was calibrating their behavior accordingly. Just a nod. Person to person. Callum nodded back. Some things did not need to be said out loud, the last evening in June. The archive had closed at 5, but Nora stayed late to finish processing an incoming collection from a Southside Neighborhood Association, 80 years of meeting minutes and correspondence, and photographs of people whose names were not recorded anywhere public. The kind of collection that arrived without announcement and required careful, patient work. She moved through the stacks, turning off the lights section by section as she finished, the old habit, the way she had been closing the archive for 4 years. Each light that went dark was a section she had set in order, a set of things properly kept. Callum was at the door when she reached the last section, coat over his arm, not checking his watch, not shifting his weight, just standing there, the particular patience of someone who has learned that some things cannot be hurried and are worth waiting for regardless. She turned off the last light. She walked toward him in the dark. She knew the way. This was her space. She had never needed light to navigate it. She said, "Ready?" He said, "Yes." They walked out together. The door closed behind them. The lock engaged with a clean, solid click. Her father had spent 20 years mapping what mattered. She understood now what he had been working toward. Not an archive of damage, not a record of all the ways power had been used badly in the city, though that was in there too. A record of what was worth protecting, what deserved to survive. She had his hands, his habit of noticing, his particular faith that the right things, properly kept, would outlast the wrong ones. She carried that forward. She carried it alongside someone who had spent 11 years believing that knowing everything was the same as being safe, and who was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, that the things most worth knowing were the ones you let yourself discover rather than anticipate. The archive held 34,000 documents. It held her father's work. It held, in a sealed and restricted box in the climate-controlled back room, the full record of 20 years of what Chicago had done in the dark, and what Edmund Voss had considered important enough to preserve. It held, in a second sealed box with a 25-year restriction and a single authorized access name, everything Callum Reyes had done and survived and chosen and regretted. And it held, cataloged under no system and filed in no drawer, the particular kind of quiet that settles into a room when two people have stopped performing for each other and started simply being. That too was worth keeping. That too was the cartographer's daughter's work. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
There is a moment in this story that stays with you long after the last page. Not the dinner, not the confrontation, not even the map. It is the moment Callum Reyes sits alone in his office, opens a file with Nora's name at the top, looks at the blank page beneath it, and closes it without filling anything in. No surveillance, no background check, no intelligence gathered in advance. For the first time in 11 years, he chose not to know. That is the whole story, distilled into one quiet act that nobody witnessed. We live in a world that rewards preparation, that celebrates the person who has already read the room before they walk into it. We are told that knowledge is power, that information is protection, that the more you know about a situation before it happens, the safer you are. And there is truth in that, real truth. But this story asks a harder question. What happens when the habit of knowing everything becomes a wall you hide behind? What happens when the need to be prepared becomes a reason to never be surprised, never be moved, never let anything reach you that you did not already account for? Callum Reyes built an empire on that wall, and it cost him his brother. It cost him Edmund Voss, and it almost cost him the one person who could have reached him because he was so busy cataloging her that he forgot to simply be present with her. The lesson is not that preparation is wrong. The lesson is that there is a difference between using knowledge to protect people and using knowledge to avoid the vulnerability of caring about them. Edmund Voss understood this. He spent 20 years in the most dangerous information landscape imaginable, and what he built was not a weapon. It was a record of what was worth protecting. Every person he documented because they mattered to him. That was his power, not control, care. And Nora spent 8 months being careful in a world that had tried to make her small. The world looked through her every single day, and instead of fighting to be seen, she used that invisibility with precision, with patience, with the specific intelligence of someone who understands that the most powerful position in any room is the one nobody is guarding. She did not reveal herself at that dinner because she was forced to. She revealed herself because she chose to, because she decided that the story of her father's life deserved to be spoken out loud, in the room where it mattered most, by the person who had the right to speak it. That is what this story is really about. Not power, not crime, not even love, though love is woven through every page of it. It is about the courage to be known by the right people at the right time, on your own terms. Edmund mapped what mattered. His daughter carried it forward, and the man who thought he knew everything learned, at last, that the things most worth knowing are the ones you let yourself discover, rather than the ones you already prepared an answer for. That is the cartographer's lesson, and it belongs to all of us.